And I'm Henry Hale, co-director of PONARS Eurasia, currently with Madeleine Laruelle, my colleague at GW. And we're very happy to be able to host, with the generous support of Carnegie Corporation of New York and our own institution, Institute for European Russian Eurasian Studies, and other higher levels of the university here at GW to have this special celebratory conference, which marks the 20th anniversary-ish of PONARS Eurasia. I say ish because the sort of genesis of it all is actually 1996. But then somewhere between 96 and 97, it started to emerge into a full organization. And to celebrate this moment, I think there's nothing more appropriate than to invite the chief founder of PONARS Eurasia, Celeste Wallander, who came up with the idea, working with Carnegie Corporation of New York representatives, Aster Tinez and David Speedy, I think, and others. Diana Arsenian, of course, to found it. And I think maybe I'll just say just a few words about its organization and then talk about where Celeste is now. I was not originally involved as a member. My initial role was to come in shortly after its genesis as an administrative assistant, as a graduate student looking for a few extra dollars. We got much more out of it, and eventually they saw fit to include me as a member. I'm not sure exactly when that happened, but I'm very grateful for it. So PONARS went from initially being the program on new approaches to Russian security, so focused primarily on Russia, and primarily focused on junior scholars who were sort of finding their footing in the post-Soviet, the new at the time, post-Soviet environment, helping them support each other's work and also make important connections to the policy world. I certainly have very early memories of Celeste telling all of us kind of how we should think about, as academics, think about trying to communicate with policymakers. And I think this is something that Celeste will talk about more now that she has such rich experience on both sides. But among other things, one of the things that we've internalized is that often, as academics, we're less good at suggesting particular concrete policies and maybe better at doing some other things, focusing on kind of bigger picture interpretations. So that's a lot of what we've been focused on. So since its origins as a organization focused more on junior scholars and focused on Russia, it's evolved a great deal. The scholars have gotten more senior. We've tried to regularly refresh its ranks with more junior members. It's broadened from its initial focus on Russia. Very early that happened to expand to a great deal more Russian members, so that was an important move. Then a number of Ukraine was supported by MacArthur Foundation. Then a large contingent of Ukrainians were brought in, and then in the 2000s, I believe with the move to Georgetown, was it? The focus explicitly shifted to become PONARS Eurasia. And so the name changed to the program on new approaches to research and security in Eurasia. And so since then, we've been able to expand to include members from a large number of the post-Soviet countries. So I won't name them all here. But basically, PONARS moved with Celeste, so she initially founded when she was at Harvard, and then moved to Council on Foreign Relations, then to CSIS, then to Georgetown, before coming to GW here in 2009. So the shift here came when Celeste first joined the Obama administration as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia. After that, she became Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Russia, Eurasia on the National Security Council under President Obama. And with Obama's leaving office, so she's now serving as President and CEO of the U.S.-Russia Foundation, where they're doing lots of very interesting things that I think anyone interested in Russia should be or become aware of. So let me wrap up with that, and just to thank Celeste for founding what I think is become a great institution that's involved many other people, certainly besides myself in the leadership at different points. Steve Hansen, Corey Welch, who I saw here earlier, and now co-director Marlene Well. And it's just been a great pleasure and honor to be able to co-lead this organization for the last few years. So Celeste now will talk and share some reflections on scholarship, knowledge, and understanding in U.S.-Russia policy. And then she said that she's happy to talk about whatever sorts of topics you might want to raise in the question and answer period. So let me turn things over to Celeste.
Thanks very much, Henry. Thank you very much for inviting me. This is, I wouldn't say it's 20th anniversary-ish. It's 20th anniversary because in 1996 it was a workshop, sort of a brainstorming workshop to figure out whether this was a good idea and what it might look like. So PONARS really did start in 1997, so I think you're on solid ground. And I think you were invited to become a member as a result of a membership meeting that was held on a riverboat on the Volga River in Nizhny Novgorod, and we had a membership committee meeting. Steve, did that sound right? Yeah, that was fun. That was the day I got to swim in the Volga River. That was really.
We all remember that.
I think there are pictures, so but not today. And I'm really grateful actually to Henry and to Corey and to everyone who decided that. When I had the opportunity to serve in government, and I didn't want PONARS to end, I really wanted to be able to hand it over to someone I knew could continue it, could help it evolve, could even make it stronger and larger, and Henry, you've really done that, and it's great. I love going around Washington and referring to so-and-so is my former student, so-and-so is my former student. There's quite a few, actually, which says something about how old I am, but few give me greater pleasure than to be able to claim you, Henry, as my former student. So I'm really glad that PONARS is led by you and the team here at GW. I knew that you would be spending a lot of time today talking about Russia, Ukraine, Georgia, all the countries of Eurasia that are the focus, research focus, and expertise of PONARS members. So I thought I actually wouldn't talk about policy, at least to start. I'm happy to, but I thought I'd start out somewhere else, which is more to talk about us. What do I mean by us? I mean us, those who are scholars and experts and teachers in the field of Russian, post-Soviet, and Eurasian studies. And that's why when Henry asked me for a title of the talk, I framed it as scholarship, knowledge, and understanding in U.S. policy, U.S.-Russia policy. So I started PONARS making the argument that people in the policy world were not benefiting from the knowledge and research of a new crop of mostly social scientists who had been graduate students when I was a graduate student at the end of the Cold War, at the end of the Soviet period, and we were incredibly lucky as a cohort of young, soon-to-be professors that because of the changes that were happening within the Soviet Union, in global politics, and certainly in the United States, we had opportunities for doing the kind of research and asking the kinds of really important social scientific questions that many of our senior professors who had been great mentors and teachers and scholars themselves hadn't really been able to explore. We were able to do field work, we were able to use quantitative and statistical methods to ask big picture questions. We were able to feel inadequate that although we spoke Russian, our Ukrainian was pretty bad, and got to go to places like Kiev, and in my case I also have gotten to go to places like Sevastopol in Ukraine. So it was an opportunity that seemed to be underappreciated in Washington. The policy world did not know of this great cohort of fantastic young PhDs who were going to go on to become professors at all the leading universities and would be shaping the next generation of students and certainly the knowledge that would be available about these emerging political, economic, and social systems. And it seems like an enormous failure of connection. And so with support from Carnegie and then subsequently MacArthur, we were able to create that connection and to make the research and knowledge and expertise of this fabulous cohort and now its graduate students and its successor cohorts available to Washington and well known in Washington. And the way that was framed is that there's this divide between the academia and policy, and Henry's right. I mean, we had a lot of painful editing going on in some of the early PONARS memos where the term Weberian was banished, despite the attempts of one of my colleagues. And so the focus was how do we help policymakers understand how much they're missing? And that really was the focus of PONARS, and I think rightly so. But one of the things I'm struck by now from having been privileged to serve in government and having had the opportunity actually to be in policy circles by living in Washington for 17 years, it's been, is that I think actually the policy community has something to give back also to the academic community. And there is a divide in many respects, but there's a lot of commonality. And that's what I wanted to focus on today. What is the commonality? Well, first, scholarship. What is scholarship? Scholarship is about investing in your expertise, your knowledge, spending time learning a language, being willing to go and live in a different country, maybe sometimes when you actually aren't very good at, functioning in an American city. You're suddenly going off to, when you're 21 years old, going off and living in a foreign city, usually with the help of wonderful professors in universities and institutes abroad, as has been the case for many of us in Russia, in Ukraine, and Georgia, and other parts of the former Soviet Union. But you're investing in that knowledge because you care about understanding. You either love the culture, or you love the country, or you love the problems and the challenges and the questions. And academics know this. You know this because you talk to your graduate students, you talk to your students. But those same people who made those same kinds of investments are the people who are working over in the State Department, who are working in the Defense Department, who are serving abroad in embassies everywhere, who are serving in the intelligence community, who are serving even in places like the Commerce Department, U.S. Trade Representative Office. One of the things I guess I should have known in principle, because I had been a professor and I had taught students, was how incredibly well educated, at least the cohort of U.S. policy government officials are on the region, on language, on the culture, on knowing how to function in Nizhny Novgorod. And I don't know that, and maybe I'm wrong, and I would love to hear this, but I don't know that everyone in the academic world appreciates the extraordinary training and capabilities of the cohort, at least, and I'll come back to this, there's a point here, of the people I at least have worked with in the US government. I have learned so much from the time I spent at the Pentagon and from the time I spent in the NSC. The best thing about being at the NSC, other than being on the White House grounds, is that you actually get to know everybody because you're managing the interagency. So you get to see all the strengths across all the different parts of the US government. The expertise that comes, when you have a question about trade policy towards Russia, there is a person who can pick up the phone and who knows everything about trade policy towards Russia. If you have a question about military assistance to Georgia, there is a person who knows everything and is eager to tell you everything about U.S. defense assistance programs to Georgia. And it was an incredible privilege for me to get to know and work with and learn from those people. And so I think part of my message here to PONARS is it's great that PONARS conferences are set up for you to speak, but my advice, if you aren't already doing it, is also listen. Because you are talking to the other half of the expert community on Russia and Eurasia when you come to Washington and talk to people who work in the US government, including people who are retired from the US government. My Russian language capabilities pale in comparison to all the wonderful State Department Foreign Service officers who were kind of sitting behind me in meetings or supporting me in meetings. How to function in the hallways of MID, of Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Russia. I had an idea, but they really needed it. And so I guess I'm appealing for you to see this as a common community and to, wherever possible, facilitate and encourage cross-community learning and dialogue. So that's the scholarship part. Knowledge. It's related, but it's also different because, and first I'm gonna step back and say, I am enormously grateful to Carnegie for funding the study that Ted Gerber and others worked on. I've read the study in order to understand what the state of, it's focused primarily on Russian studies, but Russian and post-Soviet studies is, and I did talk to Ted when he was doing the research report, and you're beginning to see the effects of the failure to invest in area studies in general, and Russian and Slavic studies or post-Soviet studies in the cohorts within the US government. That is not to say that there aren't fantastic people who did the training, who know what they're talking about, who are eager to serve and have a career in policy and in government, and do all the hard work out in consulates and embassies. But it's harder and harder to find, for example, is really hard to find expert in the US government on Russian defense and military and security policy. There was something of an investment in the 1990s and the 2000s in a cohort that knows about Russian domestic politics, economic reform and evolution in the countries in the post-Soviet space, but almost none on military and defense and security policy. And on the one hand, that makes me happy because I get invited to everything. On the other hand, it's a real problem. And not just because of the negative turn in US-Russian relations, but because Russia is a large, powerful country with a very capable military and objectives and interests as defined by the leadership now that are not unproblematic from an American national security standpoint. And it's not going to change anytime soon. And we do not have that cohort of experts. I think in academia, I'm ready to be corrected and would love to be corrected, but certainly not in the US government. And that's going to begin to affect our ability. Part of this, our abilities to do good policy. Part of this is because of the focus of US national security policy for the last 20 years. Most general, you get promoted to general because you commanded and served in combat, and thank God that means you did not serve in Russia in the US military. It means you served in Afghanistan, many of whom are residual Russia experts, but more who are experts on counterterrorism, on South Asia, and now, of course, in the Middle East. So part of that is a result of priorities, but it's also a result of that lack of the pipeline. And universities need to get serious about that. And my message back to my friends who have to go back to universities and argue with deans and provosts about funding is that knowledge is about facts. And if you want facts to inform scholarship and policy, you have to invest in the people who are interested in the facts, capable of gathering and pulling together the facts, and conveying those facts to next generations. And so while theory and models are extremely important for what comes next, I'm going to talk about understanding, you can't have understanding if you don't have facts. And you can't have facts on Russia, on Kazakhstan, on Armenia, on Moldova, if you don't have people who speak Russian. You can probably still get away with people who speak Russian and not Kazakh or Romanian. But you need people who've actually spent 4 years in college studying this stuff, worked with professors who know how to get them some kind of internship or fellowship that lets them live in those countries and learn about and from the people who live in those countries. And if universities fail this, there's going to come a crisis in the next 10 to 20 years where it's going to be the fault of all those deans and provosts who refuse to invest in facts when someone makes a big mistake. You can quote me, and you can tell your deans and provosts that.
We should put that on YouTube.
Empirical knowledge about foreign policy doesn't require only understanding theories and models in history, although it does. It requires understanding the interests, priorities, and choices of decision makers in other countries as well as our own. And to understand those choices, you have to understand the political context in which they operate. Let me not give you a Russia example. Let me give you an American example. trying not to be partisan here, there were a lot of expectations about a complete turnaround in U.S. Relations with Russia after January 20th. What political scientist who studies American politics thought that was likely? No. Political scientists who are experts on American politics know that there is a congressional role in foreign policy, that it's hard to implement foreign policies if they're not funded, that the media matters, and reporting on what's going on in the White House is a very strong focus of what the American media reports, that the American public opinion on foreign policy priorities and national interests actually matters and constrains politics in the United States because of the nature of our political system, because of the nature of our economic interests, and because of the nature of our interests more broadly and globally. So I, for one, was kind of puzzled that everyone thought there was going to be a light turned, a switch turned on January 21st, and you were going to get a complete change in policy. Of course you were. Anyone who had asked an expert on American politics would know that. So why do universities not invest in the people who are sitting here who could tell you what the Kremlin is thinking, what the political constraints and incentives surrounding President Putin are? I just leave it there. I know I'm speaking to the converted. I'm just trying to give them material. Okay. So now understanding. Now understanding is actually where most academics think they have and you're right, you have the strong suit compared to, say, Washington and the media. Because understanding is about underlying theories and models. It's about cause and effect relationships. It's about testing what independent variable affects what variables. It's about, it's about trying to not just describe a reality or a fact. It's about trying to explain how they operate in the world and what the implications are. And that's what theories and models and counterfactual testing and empirical analysis and theory testing is all about. But cause and effect imbues every day in the policy world. And I'll give you an example. When in the fall of 2014, Ukraine was facing repeated escalation of the conflict in the Donbass. And it became apparent that there was direct Russian military intervention in the Donbass. There were many policies floated as a good idea. One of the ideas was to supply Ukraine with a particular kind of, I hate this term, lethal weapon. Someone tell me what a non-lethal weapon is, and I'm really interested to hear that, what that category sounds like. But anyway, lethal weapons, namely javelin anti-tank weapons, with the idea that if the Ukrainian military had the capability on the front lines to launch or threaten or actually use effective anti-tank weapons, it would either deter or defeat the military escalation that was underway in August and September of 2014. Implicit in that is an argument about cause and effect. It's actually multiple arguments about cause and effect. One implicit argument in that is that you could deliver sophisticated American anti-tank weapons to what was still at the time basically a leftover Soviet army, and it could effectively learn to use those weapons, incorporate them into battlefield units, and then use them effectively on the battlefield. Some people made that argument, others argued against it, but there's an argument that requires that you understand what the Ukrainian military was at the time, what it was capable of, how it was led, and whether those weapons could actually be effectively used. I'm not saying they couldn't, I'm telling you there was a debate about that. And in the course of that debate, those who were advocating for and those who were arguing against didn't use sort of theories of civil-military relations or theories of what makes for effective battlefield organization, but they implicitly did. They were making causal arguments about what would work, what would have an effect. Those who were arguing that these weapons would defeat Russian military operations in the Donbass were similarly making arguments that had all kinds of cause and effect packed in there about, again, the effectiveness of Ukrainian use of the weapons, but also the capabilities of the Russian military. And in the course of arguing about whether these weapons would actually make a difference that would allow the Ukrainian military to defeat Russian-led units or Russian-supplied units and Russian tanks, there were very different arguments, cause and effect arguments, about the capabilities of the Russian military and how the Russian military, in the face of opposition and in the face of more sophisticated weapons, would respond. And that was the terrain on which that debate raged back and forth, those different explanations or analyses, cause and effect arguments. And finally, the argument that most of you probably heard in public was the argument about deterrence. That improving Ukraine, again, this is already assuming that providing the weapons would improve Ukrainian ability. It assumed the cause and effect argument that improved ability would actually create the conditions for defeating Russian military forces, including Russian tanks, in the Donbass. Then there was an argument, and that'll deter the Russians from escalating any further. Now you can have your views on that, and the debate raged in public, so you know what happened with this debate in public. But what I want to highlight for you is there is an inherent cause and effect debate within that policy discussion that had to be surfaced about, and with reference to, well, what do we know about how the Russian military and Russian political leadership has responded in the face of a first failure? Are they deterred? Do they adjust? Do they change? I'm not going to tell you about who argued what. That's not fair and classified, so I'm not going to talk about that. But I'm trying to help you understand that you had really smart people who knew a lot of history, who had studied the Russian military, who had studied how the Russian military intervened in Afghanistan, had studied Russian military operations in Georgia, watched every Russian military exercise, declared or undeclared, to try to figure out the answer to these cause and effect arguments. And so what I'm trying to convince you is that, yes, cause and effect, theory, models, all of that is the purview of the academic world, but it's also the purview of the policy world. It uses different rhetoric, different language, different norms, different, sort of clan behaviors, different kinds of verbiage. And the standards of evidence, may be different, but the stakes are a lot higher. So the standards of evidence are actually usually pretty high when you're arguing for something that could lead to a military escalation and either the end of a conflict or its worsening. And so when you think of yourselves as social scientists, think of people in government, your policy counterparts, probably your former students, hopefully your future former students, as your colleagues and your counterparts. And you actually have a lot to learn from them about cause and effect, and what actually is just nice in theory, or what actually works in the real world, and from experience and from close observation. I've learned a lot from that. I am not teaching right now. If I ever teach again, I would incorporate that into how I teach, not just classic scholarship and classic history and classic models of Russian and post-Soviet military defense and security policy, but I would build into that, stopping and thinking about really concrete case studies and how to work out the cause and effect arguments that policymakers or policy implementers have to lay out and defend if they're going to win the day in the argument. So I hope I've convinced you that what we're really talking about is a two-way street and a common community with different parts, and that maybe that common community and that recognition of that common community will help those of you who have to go back and argue with provosts and deans. U.S.-Russia Foundation is actually interested in supporting building American expertise on Russia. Russia is our focus. There are other we have sister foundations that focus on other countries in the region. I think that there is a need and an opportunity, but outsiders aren't going to be able to make the argument. I'm just trying to give you ammunition. In the end, this is a incredibly important moment for making sure that U.S. national policy and national interests are well served over the next generation. And unless these arguments are made and won in a cause and effect way with lots of evidence within universities, I don't think that there's much that the policy world on the outside can do, because we're one community with universities.
Great, I think that's just wonderful advice. And so we have about half an hour, 25 minutes left for discussion. So let's just open it up. So I see Elise back there. If you just identify yourself.
Hi, Elise
Wait for the
Giuliano.
microphone, please.
Oh, great.
Hi, Elise Giuliano. Nice to meet you across the room, and thank you for founding PONARS. I have two comments, I think, or questions. One is that I'm the director of the master's program at Harriman Institute at Columbia University, and we've noticed a decline in students applying in the last few years, which seems counterintuitive. And so, as we struggle with how to address this problem, one of the hypotheses is that the degree just costs too much money. So I'm wondering, your thoughts on making a case that there could be kind of exceptional policies made to administrations about reducing costs or subsidizing, and the other problem is that institutes have a lot of things to spend money on, and the directors have to be on board with offering more scholarships, which is something that Harriman Institute has begun to do. So your thoughts about that? And then the second question I have is, I found your comments today very, very interesting and positive. But many years ago when I was on the market, I was offered a job by West Point Military Academy, and I was happy to receive the offer, and I thought long and hard about it. And one of the reasons why I didn't take the job, besides the fact that classes began at 7 a.m. every single day, was that I was told that sometimes the U.S. military asks the professors to do some projects for them, do some research for them, and I just was not interested in having my research agenda set by the military. So more broadly speaking, could you talk a little bit about the kind of contract research that the government or the military or the different parts of the government put out there to the specialists or burgeoning specialists, and why that's not enough, or how far that goes to creating this kind of specialists on different issues? Because we know there's a lot of that. We have colleagues here who work for some of these government contractors who do this kind of specialized research specifically on certain projects, and I'm just wondering if you could talk about how that integrates to the general problem that you've discussed today. Thank you.
Unless you'd rather like a few things.
No, that's fine. So I'll take the second one first and then go to scholarship. So I was at my desk at the NSC or when I was at the White House at 7 a.m. every morning, and I had already run 6 miles. So the 7 a.m. thing is, yeah, I guess. But then I can't, I'm used after 9 p.m. So I'm not any fun to have long conversations about video late into the evening. Well, even if it was early in the evening, I wouldn't be fun talking about video.
7:30 a.m.
I think your question on that came out of your offer from West Point raises two separate questions. One is, and I don't know the answer to it, is there intellectual independence possible if you teach in a U.S. government institution, university? I honestly don't know. I know people who have taught at West Point and the Naval Academy. I don't think I know anyone who's taught at the Air Force Academy. And I have never heard that they felt like they couldn't do the research they wanted, or that they had to do research that was a directive from their employer, but it's possible. And that may be a flaw in that model if it's true, because then you're not going to have access to the full range of expertise and scholarship as potential professors. but maybe it's true. But I don't really want to comment on that because I don't know if that, I'm not saying it is, your experience wasn't correct, but I don't know that that is a general requirement of employment at the military academies or National Defense University or other U.S. government-run institutions of higher education. On contractors and people agreeing to do projects funded by the U.S. government, I guess my view is it plays you have a choice. You can do it or you cannot do it. Foundations also don't fund everything. They fund things that they're interested in or they think are important and interesting. And so, and then think tanks or other institutions can either do that research or decide that's not interesting and they'll try and find the money elsewhere. I know it's hard to find money, believe me, that's why I'm glad I'm the president of a grant-making foundation, not the president of a think tank right now. But I think we all make these choices, and so if there is as long as you have a broad enough community of experts, no one should feel compelled to do research that they are uncomfortable with. I do think that it's legitimate for academics to not wish to do government research or be funded by government projects, because that could constrain your ability to operate freely in the countries that you want to do research in. That's perfectly legitimate to make that choice, and I can well imagine why someone would make that choice. But that is a personal choice about where your priorities are. If the only way you can get money to do a project you think is important, and these days the only way to get money to work on foreign and security policy issues probably is to look at, well, Carnegie is still being very supportive, but it really does kind of come down to some of these contracts. You have to make a choice yourself about whether you think the research and the expertise is worth accepting money from an institution that may create challenges for you down the road. I don't ever remember, I didn't have a lot of, I was involved in defining some research projects that we offered project money to different think tanks in Washington on issues that we were interested in exploring. And my experience is that the protections in that process are very strong to prevent a strong political policy thumb on that research. The choice of a topic obviously is driven by policy interests, but the content of the reports, there are all kinds of protections against that, in some ways more than with some foundations or private donors on think tank research, as we've learned from some investigative reporting. On scholarships, I think it is a huge challenge because, and I always advise students, because the reality is you're probably going to have to pay for a master's. You can probably, depending on your financial situation, you can probably get an undergraduate degree with some kind of financial assistance. You should not, others may have a different view, I advise students from paying for a PhD. You find a PhD program that'll let you teach or give you a scholarship or work for a professor or something, but it's not worth, 7 years. 7 years is hard enough without, 7 years of debt. And because the money's there eventually. And I'm confident that, you can find that a good student will find the right place and the right mix in the end. But master's students, most master's programs, let's just be fair, are money-making operations for universities. This is fair. They fund the fact that PhD students don't have to pay for tuition, and they fund a lot of undergraduate scholarships. That's the choice that's been made, because they're professional degrees, and because most people, at least in Washington, going back and getting a master's, are working. And so many of the master's programs in Washington especially are designed so that you can work full-time and then, still get an MA over several years. Very strong programs, not least because I'm sitting in one of them, in the home of one of them. But the reality is it's extremely hard to get a master's program, a degree paid for. And I think this is something we have to examine, because there aren't a lot of jobs in Russian and Eurasian studies these days, and a lot of people are going into a lot of debt to get a master's because they're hoping that it will advance them to the next stage in their career, and it's not clear those jobs are there, and it's not clear we're being honest with those students when they're taking on that debt. So yes, if someone could come up with a way to create scholarship programs for master's students, maybe, top tier master's students, make it competitive, that would be something to argue to foundations like the U.S. Social Foundation, or to other foundations that are interested in supporting education. And I know that was one of the, and I took that, actually, one of the things I learned, I really appreciate that I learned from Ted's report, was how important supporting master's education is to supporting the whole chain, from undergraduate to PhD. And I hadn't thought of it in those terms. And if it is the case that we have a big hole in the middle there, that risks the education on both ends, and that's something seriously worth attention. I agree.
Okay, let's see, Adam? Just over here.
Adam Silver at Georgetown. Celeste, thank you.
Just over here for the microphone.
Thank you for bringing me into the fold here. And I have two quick questions, but they've bedeviled me. One is, I'm curious from your previous perspective inside the government, what is the value added of engaging academics versus think tanks and research institutions, especially in the foreign security and defense policy areas? In other words, how would you recommend that academics and scholars position themselves? And the other one is that, like you, I'm a kindred spirit, that we're all part of the same community, but sometimes we speak different languages. And I was wondering, since you've sort of had experience all across the spectrum here, what are some of the tips that you would lend in terms of the ways of communicating some of the academic research in a constructive way?
Value added of universities as compared to think tanks. I think that, and without saying anything critical of my colleagues and friends who are here who may be from think tanks, I think there is a problem in most think tanks that their research is being driven by where they can get the funding. And in universities, there's none of that, but there's a lot less of that. And so I think that the ability to hear what the kind of community of professor experts think is important for policymakers to know, not just what they think, they can pick up when they're going to think tank, because the research agendas of think tanks are driven by funders, who are largely foundations who are well-meaning, wonderful, thank God we have them, but it is different. And that was one of the reasons PONARS was created, because Washington wasn't asking fundamental questions about regional politics in Russia and how that might affect national policy and those sorts of things. Now, I think it's so normal to assume that. I think that's one of our successes, is we forgot that those questions weren't being asked or talked about in Washington very much, at least not in the ways that it is now. And I think that's partly to do with PONARS. And I'm not criticizing anybody in think tank for not doing that kind of fundamental research on, how does it matter how you set up your electoral system, what kind of results are you going to get differently. It's a different mission set. But you're going to miss that if you only talk to people in the think tank world. The other problem with the think tank world, and I've told lots of my colleagues this, so I'm not talking behind their back, is that people in the think tank world spend all their time talking to one another. And so there's an echo effect in Washington, where everyone, I don't go to events very much anymore, because I kind of know everything that's going to get said before I even go, because it's too much of a common language. And so to be able to step out of that and have the benefit of those experts who really know what they're talking about, but also talk about other problems and talk about their challenges, their issues, and talk about them in a different way, I think that's the value added, not just of bringing the university community in, but bringing different communities in and having access more broadly to all those communities. On communications, we worked on this in PONARS. Are we still having this problem? You just jarred. One of the biggest problems of PhD training is the whole point of the years 2 through 3 of PhD training is to teach really smart people how to talk in ways that no one else understands, because it makes them sound smart to their professors. So you have to untrain all those professors, junior professors, and we spent a lot of time doing that, to explain things clearly. And I always told my students, and I lectured some of you, that if someone doesn't understand your explanation, don't say, oh, they don't understand. Your first assumption should be, I didn't explain it. Because you can't do anything about it if they're not understanding. You can do something about it if you didn't explain it well. So if you get blank looks the first time, you clearly didn't do a very good job of explaining it. And in Washington, having people understand you is really important because everyone's busy. And if you kind of are talking, they're gonna go, I gotta go work on that meeting my boss wants me to prepare her for. They're not gonna sit there and listen to you. So if you wanna be effective, you have to retrain yourself to be clear. And actually, I actually think that professors can do this because that's actually what you do in your undergraduate teaching, I hope. I hope you don't talk to your little 18-year-olds in, Introduction to Russian Politics the way you're talking a graduate seminar to second-year PhD students who are being inculcated in the jargon, right? So, and that's not because they're 18, it's because they aren't part of the jargon. And most of the world isn't part of the jargon. So kind of your profile should be to do this. I don't think this is a problem. I think PONARS has done a great job. I have read a lot of the papers when I can, or pieces of them. So I don't think it's that hard. I actually think in some cases, not yours, but in some cases it's an excuse for sloppy thinking and not wanting to be really questioned and have to make yourself clear. Because if you can just kind of, fall back into jargon, then people can't figure out that maybe your cause-effect argument isn't so good, or maybe the facts actually don't support the cause-effect relationship you're claiming. So that's my 2 cents.
Okay, I have a number of comments and questions, so maybe I'll collect 3 and then you could respond to them, and then I apologize if you're not going to be able to get to everyone. So I have Steve, then the woman behind Steve, and then I have Regina.
Steve Hansen, William & Mary, and PONARS, and I will try to be as brief as I can. It's hard because there's a lot to say. First, thank you, Celeste, for everything you've personally done to help bridge that gap over many, many years. I just think it's really important we all know that you've been a real leader in that area, and you've helped a lot of us. An observation and then a suggestion. So the observation is, you mentioned deans and provosts. They are indeed sometimes a problem. Unfortunately, another problem is our own colleagues and department chairs who are made up of the faculty. Anyone who runs a university knows that decisions on hiring and promotion are really faculty-driven decisions. Rarely can a provost or a dean come down to a department of political science and say, we want you to hire this Russia specialist. And so the argument starts there and often falls on deaf ears for reasons we all know. Intellectually, 25 years of downgrading area studies as something unscientific haven't really had an effect. We can say we'll hire the best available athlete in a comparative politics position, and perhaps that will end up being someone who has, Ukrainian and Georgian expertise, but most likely not. And I think there was a sort of a period in the 90s and early O's where we hired so many fantastic people in our field through the best available athlete model that we got a little complacent. That shows up in Ted's report, by the way. So, people in this room who were hired under those kinds of searches, we're not seeing it as much now in the comparative politics searches, at least the ones that I've been seeing. And if anything, the divide between area studies and the mainstream has gotten worse. Just an anecdote about this observation. I was just at APSA in San Francisco and saw, to my great delight at first, that there was a breaking news panel specifically organized by APSA to bring up the Russia elections issue because it's so timely. So I decided to go, and it turned out there were no Russia specialists on the entire panel. 7 people there. They did computer science analysis of texts. They did comparison with Tunisian observations, all sorts of things. So I decided to march up to the microphone, because that's me, and I just pointed it out. I said, you're going to have a hard time investigating the independent variable if you don't have anyone who studies Russia trying to translate. So now the suggestion. So that's the observation, which is unfortunately this problem that's been with us for decades now is, in my own take, has not really changed much at all. So my suggestion is for foundations, and that is that we need more splash. Not to criticize anybody. I think Carnegie did something wonderful with these $1 million grants to get the issue foregrounded. But we need more than $1 million. It's a little like when Arkady Moshes was talking about the tens of billions of dollars a year that go to Belarus subsidies, and the West wants to do something with a couple $100 million, right? It's not going to really change it. But if we could come up with some big, splashy, multi-foundation initiative with some high-level opinion makers, and they're out there saying this is a national security crisis of the highest possible level. And we have $25 million to distribute in the next year, or $100 million to distribute would really get the ears of people. Unfortunately, given the scale of the problem, what we have now are a couple, pots of money in Title VI. It's a few million here, a few million there. Every year, Miriam Kazanjian heroically, once again this year, I think, fights to keep it. And we scramble over the little tiny crumbs from that. If we want to change this equation seriously, we need the commensurate kind of money. I don't know where. That's my suggestion.
Hi, I'm Kathy Cosman. I have a brief question, which is, I have worked connection to the State Department for several decades, and it seems to me that the State Department discourages geographic specialty. They rotate on a regular basis, as you know very well, and so very often people with really excellent Russia or post-Soviet expertise of various kinds regularly get rotated to Africa or Latin America or whatever. And likewise, often posts in the State Department that require excellent knowledge of X, Y, and Z relevant to post-Soviet realities are headed by Latin America specialists or whatever. You understand what I mean. So my question is, do you think Secretary of State Tillerson, in his much heralded reorganization of the State Department, will see fit to reorganize this aspect? Thank you.
Regina in the back.
Steve wasn't ready to question.
Yeah, okay. Then we have the next, after Regina will be the woman in the fourth row, third from my right.
Regina Smith, Indiana University. So I wanted to make a comment similar to Steve's and bring up something you raised in your talk. One thing that PONARS has done incredibly well, and here I disagree a little with Steve, is that it really did amplify the effect of Russia in comparative politics. And as Steve is going to show us in his conference in May, there's been really an interesting dialogue between comparative politics theory and Russian studies that has benefited both of them. And to my mind, there are still advantages to being a Russianist on the job market in comparative politics. In IR, the situation is dismal. So my concern, as I'm, thinking about how to address Ted's report and using the generous funding that Carnegie gave Indiana, is how do we reintegrate Russia, Eurasia, into IR? Because the IR subfield has gone one way, and it's away from the area expertise. And this, I think, is a huge problem, because if we're not training the PhDs, they can't train the MAs, and they can't attract. Remember, bombs and rockets used to be the way we hooked people. Now we hook people with game theory, right? So it's a whole different way of engaging and entering into debates. And it's really a shame. And I just thought I'd put it out there, and maybe we could have a broader conversation about re-engaging with IR and the subfield in general.
Okay, yes, kind of the fourth row here. Yeah, third person from my right, yeah.
Hello, my name is Roxana Vivigulina. I'm 23 and I want to be a kind of Central Asia analyst, maybe a scholar, I haven't decided. So when you talked about master's program and how expensive it is, and I'm like, oh God, okay. So I'm thinking about my future, and I wanted to affect American foreign policy. I came here as a young kid from Uzbekistan, and I fell in love with this country, and I would like to serve it. And I also have some experience in Central Asia, so I would like to help kind of both regions, countries, Uzbekistan, US, understand each other in that kind of way. So I was wondering, with all these problems that we talked about, what should people like me focus on? How should we, strategize our careers if masters cost so much? Then want to get to PhD, which is like 7 years, like you said. Lack of jobs, because I have to compete with a lot of people here. So, what would you recommend for us to do? Thank you.
I apologize to everyone. I think we have a lot of people with comments or questions, but we're running out of time, so let me return it to Celeste.
All right, thanks, yeah, okay, got it. It is true that in the state, and I've never served in the State Department, I served with people in the State Department, I've taught people who then served in the State Department. The State Department does have a period, especially the beginning of one's career, where you need to get regional breadth. One of my friends and colleagues, Toria Newland, laughs about her first, she learned Russian, she was at FSO, and then where did they send her? She got sent to China to the consular section. But she doesn't think that was wrong because she learned about a different country. I mean, there is a problem when you only know about the countries you served in, and you have no basis for figuring out, if you think your embassy is really poorly run, it might be that it's just a frustration that, because all embassies have to work that way because they have certain missions and they have to operate that way. And so I wouldn't, I know there are some Foreign Service officers who are sometimes frustrated that they don't get to do only their country, but I do know that the State Department does invest in Foreign Service officers who are then going to get posted to a different country and have to learn a different language. One of the young Foreign Service officers who worked for me at the NSC, who was a detailee from state, had gotten his undergraduate degree in German studies, so he was fluent in German. And then when he joined the State Department, he decided he wanted to learn Russian, so they taught him Russian, and then he served in Moscow. Then he decided that was hard enough, German and Russian, so then he decided China's really important, and he got to go off and learn Chinese, and then he worked on China for a while. This year, he's on the Iran desk after the State Department invested in him learning Persian. So I know that it is frustrating to have that expectation of breadth, and you do not want to waste resources, and you want to be mindful and thoughtful of the assignments you do. But that would be my recommendation, to be mindful and thoughtful. As for Secretary Tillerson's approach, everything we hear is that he is disrespecting and excluding area expertise. And that's going in the wrong direction, in completely the wrong direction, I think. I'm not the only person to say that, so I'm being a little critical, but not terribly political. And there is an effect, which is I have actually mentored some students who did invest in the master's, so I'm not saying don't do it, I'm just saying be mindful of what it is, who are thinking about taking the Foreign Service Officer exam, and they're not sure they want to when they see what's going on in the State Department. So we may not have a cohort of experts on Russia and Eurasia coming out of the university because of what universities are doing, and we may not have a cohort of experts on Russia and Eurasia in the State Department, depending on what the State Department does and how long this lasts. It's a real problem, a very big problem. Regina and I are, I'm glad it's better in comparative politics, but of course you're right. The situation in IR is ridiculous. I mean, I'm going to say that. Are we being taped?
There's a camera above you.
The fact that I am constantly invited to talks for John Mearsheimer to explain why Russia invaded Ukraine, it just blows my, I love John. I liked his book on conventional deterrence. I thought it was a brilliant book. Great theory, incredibly well informed historical analysis, and he knows nothing about Russia. Why would you invite John Mearsheimer to explain what Putin's doing and why he's doing it? It just boggles the mind, right? So, again, John Mearsheimer, if you hear this, I love you, I learned from you. My ability to understand Russian military operations actually is rooted in the studies I did in his work. But I call it the Clint Eastwood rule, a man's got to know his limitations. Similarly, game theory is really useful. I actually used it in the White House once. We were having a conversation about arms control agreements, and when it's rational to stay in an arms control agreement, and when it's rational to call a foul. And I had to remind everyone that our arms control theory, the rational basis for arms control theory, is based on the analysis of iterated prisoner's dilemma. And I sat down and walked everyone through it and went, oh, right. So, it only makes sense to cooperate in iterated prisoner's dilemma as long as you're not being exploited. And that's the rational basis for arms control. If you're being exploited, then it's not rational anymore. So it's not the theory that's the problem. It comes back to what I said. It's the university world, and especially IR, forgets that it's not just about models, it's about facts. And for facts, you can have election statistics, those are facts, or election data, that's facts. You can have economic data, that's facts. But the statements of a leader in another country, where you were actually able to read it in the native language, those are facts that inform your understanding of foreign policy. And the IR community is disrespecting knowledge and facts with what they're doing. I can't do anything about that. I'm not in the university anymore, but I agree with you, that is exactly the problem. But what I would argue is area studies people should not denigrate theory in that. And I'm preaching to the converted here, but I do think it gets framed as a duality, especially in IR, between theory and, sort of empirics. We shouldn't buy into that or allow that. So I'm not saying go get a master's. And in fact, I think too many people in Washington especially get PhDs. I think we should have more support for, you don't need a PhD unless, technically, you don't need a PhD unless you're gonna be a professor, I think. If you want to get a PhD, and I've encouraged students who say, I don't want to be a professor, but I want to write a PhD. It's like, okay. Have fun with that, but do it. I mean, if you just want to do it, of course, but don't do it instrumentally to get, a policy job. It's fine. I'm not saying you'd be less educated, you'd be more educated, it'd be great, but it's a different kind of training, and it's not really necessary. But people like me who've made that argument have really failed you and your cohort, because we haven't made the argument about how important it is to make the master's opportunities affordable and reasonable in this environment. And I would say it is worth it, as long as you're very mindful of your focus and also the community you reach out to while you're getting a master's. Because it's not like when you get a PhD and you apply for a professor job, it matters that people know who you are, but there's kind of a regular cycle of you apply and the horror, and God, I'd never go through that again, of applying for academic jobs. But it's a different world at the level of like a master's expert. It's knowing about, it's people knowing your abilities, it's knowing what the opportunities are, it's having experience, it's being pragmatic, it's having a reputation for being a team player, all those kinds of things. And so it's not just about the master's, it's about your professional education and your professional persona. And good programs in Washington do that. I hope Harriman does it, I hope other master's programs outside of Washington do it, but the good programs in Washington do that. So when you're looking for a program for a master's, that's what you should be looking for, that whole professional experience, not just the classes.
Okay, we have 10 minutes now just to stretch legs before the next panel starts, which will be on evolving societies in Southern Eurasia. So before that, please join me in giving Celeste a warm round of applause for her panel.